Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any absolute appeal to authority. Just before we start the talk, I would like to quickly draw your attention to a 2-day festival the Middle Way Society will be running in April 2020 in Birmingham in the UK. Our keynote speakers will be Ian McGilchrist and Stephen Batchelor, talking about brain lateralization and the Middle Way and Buddhism and the Middle Way respectively. There'll be other well-known speakers giving talks about a wide range of topics such as psychology, education, the arts, science, meditation, as well as various practical sessions, all interpreted through the lens of the Middle Way. If you're interested, please check out our website www.middlewaysociety.org for more details. Our guest today is Adam Luecke, who is currently an assistant teaching professor at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. His research focuses on multiple areas of social psychology, including prosocial behaviour and the benefits of mindfulness. He's done a wide range of research that suggests that mindfulness increases analytical thought, decreases just world beliefs, reduces discrimination and implicit age and race bias. This research will be the topic of our discussion today. Hello, Adam. Welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Hello, Barry. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. So, could you perhaps begin, Adam, by telling us a little bit about your background and what it was that attracted you to this particular field of work?
Yeah, so I was in graduate school at the time. I had been doing meditation already for probably a couple years. I had been reading books kind of about meditation a little bit, philosophizing about it. And usually every night before bed, I would do it, sometimes during the day as well, for 10, 15 minutes, just focusing on my breath and everything. And I found it really helped me relax, reduce stress, help me sleep, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then we had weekly lab meetings. My advisor would basically get together some social psychologists or people who were interested in social psychology. We would meet every week and kind of discuss an article for the week. And one of the articles that was assigned for one of the weeks dealt with mindfulness and how it could improve insight problem solving.
Yeah.
And I found that really, really fascinating. I thought that something that's so simple and easy to do could actually help people solve these really creative type problems better, just from a simple, I think they used like a 10-minute mindfulness meditation right before the problems were given to these participants.
Yeah.
So I found that really, really fascinating. So I thought that given my interest in meditation as it was already, and that I was already looking at ways to kind of make the individual more efficient or more free, I guess you could say, give them more freedom and make them improve in the ways that they would like to. I thought that this would be a really, really fascinating area of research to pursue.
And the insights that you've garnered through your research, has that fed back to your own meditation practice at all?
Yeah, it has. Especially when I become a little bit lax on it, and I haven't done it as much as I should, and then I read new research about the benefits of mindfulness, or I'm looking to submit a paper on the benefits of mindfulness. It just reinforces the idea that this is something that I should be doing more frequently on a routine basis. It's more motivation. The more I look into the research and the more I do the research myself, it's more motivation for me to implement it in my life.
Sure. I have a similar experience because I've done quite a few interviews with people around mindfulness, and a similar process goes on for me there in a sense. Okay, well, we can have a look at this research perhaps in more detail later in our conversation. But first of all, could you, for the benefit of the uninitiated, give us a working definition of what you understand mindfulness is?
Basically, very simply, we think of mindfulness as present moment awareness without judgment. So basically being fully present, not being caught up in thoughts about the past or the future, observing the moment, observing your sensations, you observing what's unfolding in front of you, and not necessarily needing to place judgments on them like you like this thing or you dislike this experience or anything like that. It's just allowing things to happen and being present while they do.
Okay, and there's a common misconception with mindfulness and meditation that it's somehow you're actually trying to empty your mind or stop thought. Isn't mindfulness more about actually developing a different sort of kind of sensibility with the thoughts you have?
Yeah, so it's almost impossible to stop thoughts, and they will appear in your mind in regards to all kinds of number of things, whether that might be just a sensation that you have that reminds you of something that's happened in your past. Maybe you start thinking about a memory that you had. Mindfulness is really just about acknowledging that you're having a particular thought, not being judgmental about yourself for having these thoughts because they're inevitable, and then allowing them to go, allowing them to move on, and then you can get back to just experiencing the present moment.
Your research focuses a lot on biases, and you use a great quote from Jim Carrey in one of your papers, and he says, "Our eyes are not only viewers, but also projectors that are running a second story over the picture we see in front of us all the time." Can mindfulness, to an extent, then alter the way we perceive things?
Yeah, absolutely. We do come ready to see things based on our past experiences. People who are, just generally pessimistic tend to see things in a more negative way. People who are more optimistic tends to see things in a more positive way. And both of those might be right and they might be wrong given the situation. But if you're always geared towards one or the other, chances are you're going to be wrong some of the time. And we do tend to carry with us our experiences and our biases, our proclivities towards seeing things in a particular way. And I think mindfulness can help us disengage from our patterns of behavior that will affect the way that we see the future or the present. One way it does this, like research has shown that it helps reduce attentional negativity bias, so that the tendency to focus on something negative and continue to focus on that thing, which can kind of make the world around you seem like a darker place. And obviously that affects your mood and your tendency to interpret people's behavior around you and things like that. So it reduces attentional negativity bias, so it actually makes the world seem less negative than you might otherwise think it is. Other things that mindfulness has been shown to improve is stuff like life satisfaction. So people who don't necessarily have, let's say, gratitude for the things in their life, mindfulness actually helps improve their outlook over the things around them, to actually maybe almost see a silver lining in their lives and being able to see more positive aspects of their lives. Just generally see the world in a more, disengaged manner that doesn't necessarily, like that quote says, project the past experiences onto the world as much. Because we're always going to do that to some extent. No one's ever going to be able to completely disengage from their patterns of behavior or their thought processes. But mindfulness gives us a little bit of more wiggle room, I think, so that we can understand the moment and what's happening in it and other people's behavior and our own a little bit more objectively.
Presumably these biases were at some stage in our evolutionary history, or maybe for a long period of our evolutionary history, adaptive. Like, for example, with the negativity bias, if there were, when you were out on the savannah and there came some news that there were some strawberries in one valley or a ferocious bear in the other, it would have paid to pay more attention to the news about the bear. And that those people who had that negativity bias obviously passed on their genes, presumably. So they were helpful in many ways. But why do biases get us into trouble in modern day life more than they did when we were out there, as hunter-gatherers?
Well, I don't know if they get us more into trouble nowadays than they did back then. I guess you could think about it in terms of, continue with your example, the negativity bias keeps them more safe in those types of ways, but without the, I guess you would say, courage to go out and explore and be adventurous, you're also not gaining the potential benefits that are out there to be had. So that's a detriment to their ability to move on and procreate and find more food and be healthier and all that kind of stuff. So it can work both ways, right? You might have more of a negativity bias, which is geared towards keeping you safe, but at the trade-off of not being able to gain rewards that might be out there. Certainly today's society is more complex and there's more ways that you can get into trouble. So from that perspective, a negativity bias can get you into trouble with the people that you work with because you're always thinking the worst of them and their behavior, or obviously your family members. If you don't give them the benefit of the doubt, you're going to build resentment towards them and you're going to always think that they're out to get you. These complex social relationships we're much more contact with people today, and we're much more interconnected today than we ever have been in the past, especially with the internet. And that's why you see on social media, a lot of times it's just filled with people screaming at each other because they don't give each other the benefit of the doubt. They always think they're coming from the worst side of things. Yeah. So when you're geared towards seeing the most negative in people like that, and you have access to millions of people, the world's going to seem like a much more dark place than it actually is.
So how do we normally, when we come across people, interpret people's actions in a way that can sometimes get us into trouble?
Well, a lot of that depends on the individual. Obviously, I mentioned pessimism versus optimism earlier. So obviously, a pessimist is much more likely to see the negative in people's actions. Optimist is much more likely to see the positive. A lot of personality characteristics help dictate how we're going to interpret other people's actions. But one type of bias that we generally have with regards to other people, especially people we don't know, is something called the correspondence bias. Essentially, the tendency to attribute a dispositional motive to someone's actions and downplay the situational motive. So if we see like a mother kind of being angry with and berating her child, we have a tendency to say, oh, she's a bad mother. Like that's a personal characteristic. Like her behavior is an example of who she actually is as a person, rather than saying, well, wait a second, there might be a situational element to this where the child did something really, really, really bad and they actually need to be chastised for their own safety or for their own benefit. Or maybe the mother is having a particularly hard day, that she's stressed, maybe someone in her family died. All of these potential situational elements that could be having an impact on this particular scenario, human beings tend to downplay in favor of a dispositional explanation. Mm-hmm. So that can be a problem when we attribute people's behavior to who they are as a person. Oftentimes we don't take into account how the situation might be making them look worse than they actually are, or in some cases look better than they actually are. And research actually has been done in this area too. Mindfulness actually does reduce the correspondence bias. It makes us take the situation into account a lot more than if we hadn't been mindful. So that's incredibly important because it's something that most people do when coming across people in their environment and watching their behavior. And it's good not to attribute personal flaws to situations that could be just as easily explained as situational.
Mm-hmm. So you say that mindfulness, with the correspondence bias, for an example, takes more of the situation into account. So it takes in the, let's say, the bigger picture a lot more. So how does it do that?
I think I don't know exactly why it does this, but if I had to venture an educated guess, I would think it's because mindfulness helps us disengage from our automatic types of thinking. So the automatic tendency would be to say in this situation, oh, that mother is a bad mother, that mother is very rude, or that the person who cut us off in traffic is a jerk, right? Like that's a very knee-jerk reaction. That is just that general tendency that human beings have to interpret people around them. because it's so automatic, we do it without thinking about it. Mindfulness can help us put a little bit of a space in between that automatic thought process or that automatic feeling towards that other person, and help us not necessarily use that automatic thought or feeling in our overall interpretation of the person. So it helps to give us a little bit more freedom in assessing that holistic situation rather than just going with our first automatic response.
Yeah. Obviously, you're not a neuroscientist or anything, but like, I mean, what you're saying is that in a sense, it helps you to respond more to your situation than react to it, and you can stand back a little bit. From a neuroscientific perspective, could that be argued that the prefrontal cortex or the executive function is coming more into play rather than just the sort of the more mammalian part of your brain is dominating? Is that perspective something that you've come across?
Yeah, actually, there has been research looking at brain regions that get activated with regards to mindfulness, and the prefrontal cortex is one of those regions. It becomes online more, it's more active in general. I'm pretty sure they've done research in which the neural connections in the prefrontal cortex have become strengthened, like there's a larger volume within the prefrontal cortex, I think. I'm not sure about that one entirely, but I know that certain areas in the prefrontal cortex do become more active. And I believe there's research dealing with mindfulness in what's called the default mode network. The general mode network that our brain is generally on, and is in large part responsible for these kind of like automatic types of reactions. And the mindfulness has actually been shown to kind of reduce the activation of the default network and kind of reroute the general activity of the brain to the prefrontal cortex. So I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't know that kind of data extraordinarily well, but the bits that I have been exposed to have been pretty impressive in the things that mindfulness can do and helping us essentially take better control of our own actions and the way that we feel about things.
Now, should we have a look now a bit more of your research in a bit more details, starting with, for example, how mindfulness increases analytical thought and decreases just will beliefs?
Yeah, so that was research in which we were basically looking at helping people disengage, again, from kind of the automatic, intuitive types of responses that they generally have. So with our analytical questions, basically, these questions were designed in a way in which there's an intuitive answer that people normally give based on the way that the question is phrased, but that intuitive answer is ultimately wrong, and it requires you to kind of step back from the intuitive answer that comes to most people. And if you just sit back and work through it a little bit, you should be able to come to the answer quite a bit better. And I'd like to give you an example. One of the questions is, so you have a lake, and in that lake, there's a patch of lily pads. And every day, the patch of lily pads doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long would it take for the patch to cover half of the lake? Right? So what normally happens, the intuitive answer for people is they just cut the number of days in half and they say, well, it takes 24 days to cover half the lake. That's the intuitive answer that comes to most people's mind. But the question is that the patch of lily pads doubles in size every day. So on the 47th day, they would cover half the lake and then double on the 48th day to cover the entire thing. That would be the analytical answer. So when you are in a mindful state, we put people through just a mere 10-minute mindfulness meditation in which they went through a body scan where this woman was kind of guiding them through to focus on the sensations in their body and in a non-judgmental way. And they did this for 10 minutes, and we compared this group to a control group in which they just listened to the same woman talk about an English countryside. Is talking about the hills and the sky and all that kind of stuff. as a control, and we compared these two groups on their ability to answer these types of analytical problems. And the mindfulness group did significantly better than the control group. It's like they were better able to disengage from that automatic intuitive response that just pops up in your head and then just spills out of your mouth generally. They could kind of take a step back from that and go, well, wait a second, that doesn't quite make sense. Let's see if I can rework this and see if I come to a different answer. And they were much better at that. And in much the same way, that's kind of what just world beliefs can do as well. It's a tendency to look at the world as people get what they deserve and they deserve what they get, which to some extent is a beneficial mindset because it helps people organize the world in a meaningful way, as though it's not completely chaotic, which helps them not be so nihilistic, helps them gain psychological well-being. But it can be misplaced with things, called blaming the victim and things like that, where there is a victim of a circumstance, and if people who are very, very high on just world beliefs tends to say, well, that victim they must have deserved their fate. They must have done something to put themselves in that situation and ultimately reap the consequences of their own behavior. And a lot of times that's not an accurate assessment of the situation. And obviously it can be somewhat cold to the victim themselves. So we also looked at just world beliefs and how mindfulness might affect this perspective of the world or tendency to look at the world too. And we found also that the mindfulness group who went through the 10-minute meditation did hold significantly less just world beliefs than did the control group. That's interesting because it allows people to think about the correspondence bias. It's kind of the same thing. It allows people to think about the situation a little bit better and the situation that the person's in, and kind of take into all of these factors that, well, maybe this person didn't get what they deserved. Maybe it was a fluke accident, or maybe it was just a vile person that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time and happened to cross their path. Take into all of these situational accounts rather than just immediately go, well, it must have been something that the victim did. It's a product of their own personality that created this bad consequence for them. So it's good to kind of get away from that frame of mind and to try to be more objective about the situation and to try to see where the situational circumstances might have been at play rather than the individual.
That's absolutely fascinating. That actually potentially ties into and adds to some research from a guy called Dan Kahan I interviewed a couple of years ago. In his research, he suggests that intelligence and education are actually no safeguard against blinkered thinking, because often you've got the tools to articulate yourself better out of cognitive dissonance. And what seems key for sort of more wiser thought in essence is curiosity and an openness to being wrong. And I think to an extent, mindfulness actually cultivates those latter two. So critical thinking is a really important part of being able to make better decisions, but it's necessary but not sufficient. You seem to need something like mindfulness alongside it as well to keep that curiosity and to help you to respond rather than to react.
Yeah, that's right. Intelligence doesn't necessarily correlate with wisdom, and wisdom helps you a little bit better understand your own deficiencies. And help you understand that you might not have all the answers and that you might need to take a step back from your automatic thoughts and your automatic way of explaining the world and see if you can try to maybe take different perspectives or try to see things from a different lens. And it ultimately, I think, helps you become a little bit more objective because you're less likely to come down firm on an ultimate conclusion, and then with intelligence, like you just said, can help you really detail and describe your conclusion in ways that make sense, but may not necessarily be accurate because you haven't taken in all the relevant information about the situation. So yeah, wisdom, I think mindfulness is something that can help cultivate wisdom more than necessarily intelligence.
Yeah. Okay. Well, back to another aspect of your research, Adam. How does mindfulness reduce discrimination?
With specific regard to the research that we've done, we were interested in whether a mindfulness, again, a very brief mindfulness meditation of 10 minutes, whether that would help participants trust Black and white interaction partners similarly, with the general belief that a control group of participants who were exclusively white would probably trust in-group members, so other white people, more than out-group members, so Black individuals. We figured that mindfulness would help kind of disengage this in-group, out-group thinking and ultimately help the individual judge interaction partners as individual persons rather than as members of groups, and therefore take the individual characteristics of the person that they were interacting with into account when they were making trustworthiness judgments. So we had participants play this game, essentially, in which we told them that their goal of the game was to make as much money as possible within the context of the game. We give them 50 theoretical dollars at the beginning. We say, okay, you're going to interact with a bunch of people. You're just going to see pictures of their faces. And these are real people that we as researchers have already talked to and gotten their responses to what they would do when interacting with somebody.
Yeah.
So we told them, we think that people are really good generally at being able to detect whether people that they interact with are trustworthy based only on appearance. So you, as a participant, are going to interact. In other words, you're going to see a series of faces, and you need to judge the trustworthiness of these faces by basically determining how much money you are willing to give them, given that however much money you give them will be quadrupled. And then based on the answer that this person has given us, they're either going to take all that money for themselves or that they're going to give you half of that quadrupled money. So basically, you can double your money if this person is trustworthy, right, or you lose it all if they're not trustworthy. And the goal of the game is to try to get as much money as possible. So we found that the mindfulness group that had gone through just the 10-minute mindfulness meditation basically gave the same amount of money to white and Black interaction partners. So they saw about 50 white faces and 50 Black faces. They gave about the same amount to the 50 white as they did to the 50 Black. The group that just went through a control audio gave more money in general to the white faces. I forget exactly how much more, but it was a significant amount. So in other words, they were using in-group preferences, or potentially they were using stereotypes of the association between Black and criminality. They're potentially using that stereotype to think that the Black faces weren't as trustworthy and they were less likely to want to give them the money. So that was a really, really cool finding that the mindfulness group, 10 minutes, and these are mostly novices that are doing this mindfulness meditation, it's just a mere 10 minutes was necessary in order for them to see each person that they were dealing with as an individual person and to look at that person and try to determine whether they were trustworthy based on their basically facial expression, and to use that as their method of trustworthiness rather than all of the associations that come with white people or all the associations that come with Black people as their mode of determining trustworthiness.
Amazing. Just thinking, can mindfulness, often in a work situation, you often get these input sessions about racism and stuff, and a lot of people, if they're potentially inclined that way, they would switch off or be resistant to that. But do you think mindfulness can sort of help in that way because it's not so explicit in reducing these biases?
Yeah, so that's a tricky situation with these training programs. They're being instituted. It's pretty widespread nowadays. Yeah. Google is, I think, one of the more prominent names that is you started using these programs. I think that if you design a training program like that, which is explicitly stated as this is a program to help reduce your racism, I don't know if using mindfulness within that program is necessarily going to help, because people are going to be on high alert for being manipulated. There are already likely a lot of people who go to these programs, especially the mandatory ones that they're required to attend, are likely to be fairly surly at the idea that the company is essentially saying that they are racist and that they're saying that they have all of these tendencies to be discriminatory or prejudiced against these other groups. And there oftentimes is not a lot of evidence that these training programs work for people. In fact, you could probably argue that some people who have to go to these programs are reactant against them. Like you were alluding to, as people turn off to them because they're basically being told all of these negative things about them that might not even be true. I would say that it would be beneficial for companies in general to institute mindfulness training in general, because it has been shown to help improve not only life satisfaction, but job satisfaction. And then one of the nice kind of other little benefits that those mindfulness training programs might have is it would likely, or at least potentially, reduce any possible prejudice or discrimination that might be happening in these offices anyway, because these individuals are more likely to see the woman boss or the new black executive or the new Muslim coworker as an individual rather than as a member of their group. So the mindfulness training program could just naturally, without having to explicitly say anything about, okay, now you're going to be mindful about race, or you're going to be mindful about sex and all of these kind of hot button issues nowadays. It helps the mind become more objective in general. It helps the mind deal with a person in a less automatized way, I think, and helps you give the individual a chance to shine rather than seeing that person through the lens of all of the associations that their group members have. So I do think it has a lot of promise in work situations to benefit the lives of the employees in many different ways, including improving interpersonal relationships in the workplace in general and in between group dynamics like race and sex and things like that.
Okay, and then another area of research that you undertook was with mindfulness and implicit age and race bias. Could you tell us a bit about that? Yeah,
so we were getting back to these ideas of stereotypes, essentially, and the associations that people tend to have with certain groups. We were looking at what's known as the implicit associations test. It's pretty famous now. A lot of people have taken it on their own time. You could easily just Google it and find it. And then they have a whole host of different types of these tests that are basically reaction time tests that tell you essentially the strength of associations that you have between usually bad or good, the categories bad and good, and two other categories, some which could be white or black, or men or women, or Republican, Democrat, stuff like that. So we were interested in potentially seeing how maybe mindfulness makes the associations between two categories a little bit more balanced rather than skewed negatively towards some groups. So the IAT, as it's known, generally has found that individuals tend to show a little bit more negative associations with black than with white. So when you're trying to, I should probably talk a little bit about how it does this. Basically, it's a task in which you have to sort. So a word will come up on screen that's either a word that's associated with good or bad. So the word could be love or hate. And you have to use, say, the E key to categorize it in the left category bin, which is, let's say it's going to be good, and the right category bin will be bad, and you'd use the I key to filter the word over there. So if you saw the word hate, you should press the I key in order to sort it into the bad bin. If you saw love, you should sort it into the good bin. And then you sort black and white faces. So if you see a black face, sort it into the black bin. If you see a white face, sort it into the white bin. The kind of key here is when you have to have the combination of the two. So when you have white faces and good in one bin and black faces in bad in the other bin, is it easier for you to make those associations? So if you see a word that's bad or a black face, is that really easy to sort into the black and bad category compared when black is with the good words and when white is with the bad words? Is that a lot harder for you than when it's black and bad and good and white and good? So what it generally has found that people have an easier time sorting things when the black faces and the bad words are together than when the black faces and the good words are together. So we were thinking that maybe mindfulness would help balance this out a little bit. Maybe it would reduce this general tendency to make these quicker associations between black and bad. And that is what we found, that our mindfulness condition tended to have lower associations of black and bad than our control condition did, which was great. And we did the exact same thing with age. So instead of black and white faces, we had old and young, with the general knowledge that people tend to have more negative associations with old than they do with young. And again, the mindfulness group found that the negative associations with old were decreased overall, and they were more balanced overall between the categories. It was a little bit easier for mindfulness to sort regardless of the category, and let's put it that way. So overall, the automatic associations of bad with the elderly and with black faces were reduced in the mindfulness condition, which again gets back to a lot of what we've been discussing already, is that it reduces the automaticity of individual responding and your reliance on that automaticity to make judgments about the people around you. So now with a little bit of mindfulness training, those negative associations that might appear and might potentially negatively impact your perception of a black person or an elderly person, they might not be so strong, and they might be easier to kind of distance yourself from and treat that person again as more of an individual rather than as a collection of associations that they've accrued through stereotypes.
Sure. Well, this is really quite empowering stuff. Just wondering how aware we are of our own implicit biases. To what degree would you say? Obviously, it depends on the person, but
yeah, it really does. It really depends on the person. I think overall, people are generally pretty aware of when they feel negative towards another person. They might not know why they feel negative. That's a trickier subject. But when they come across like an elderly person, they're generally aware that, I feel awkward around them, or I feel uncomfortable, or I feel judgmental, like they feel that kind of negative presence in their body, even though they might not be able to explain it why. Sometimes for other people, they might be more blind to those negative types of feelings that they have towards members of a particular group. Again, it is definitely an individual difference kind of thing. If you're used to paying attention to the sensations in your body, then you're probably going to be more aware of the reactions that you have to the people around you than if you're not. But generally, people are pretty aware of the way they feel about other people, even if they can't quite explain why.
Sure. Yeah. We actually, last year, Adam, we ran a weekend retreat. It was entitled "Working with Prejudice." So it's almost the acknowledgement that we all have to some. Well, it's hard not to really have certain prejudices, but just working them with them. It's like, for example, like certainly in the UK, if you the times that like a word like Islam and terrorism is found in the same sentence, and you see those sentences thousands and thousands of times when you read the media, then it's hard not to get influenced by these things. So we're just being embedded in a culture, and the culture's certain take on things, it's bound to have a certain effect on everyone? I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, we're constantly looking. Well, our brains are set up basically in a way to give us as much information as we possibly can get about a person in our environment, even without knowing much about that individual, right? So if we come across a person of another group, our brain is basically going to automatically activate certain associations that have been continuously paired with that member of that group in order to try to fill in all of the gaps of lack of knowledge we have about that person, right? So we're trying to make holistic evaluations of an individual based on a complete lack of knowledge of that individual to do our best to be able to predict what's going to happen in our environment.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can obviously go awry, and stereotypes can definitely rear their ugly head and cause a lot of collateral damage to people those stereotypes don't quite fit. Even though they fit to a particular group, they might not fit that stereotype. And obviously, if you're judging people through the lens of stereotypes, then you're, again, going to cause a lot of collateral damage to those people if you're acting in negative ways based on that stereotype. So it can certainly be a very negative thing. And I definitely do think that awareness of any kinds of negative feelings that you have towards a particular group, or awareness of the belief or endorsement of any stereotypes that you have towards a particular group, was definitely a good thing. Because we're all generally aware of the stereotypes that are around us. It's a whole different animal when you endorse or fully believe that the stereotype is representative of the group as a whole, and I can accurately make judgments about individuals within that group because of the stereotype. Then you're more likely along the lines to really cause some problems and have some negative consequences in your interactions with these people. So definitely becoming aware of these things is very positive and can help you, again, be more objective in your overall interactions with people in general.
Sure. Okay, just three more questions, Adam. And the first one is a little bit fanciful and hypothetical. If you could imagine that you were in a position of quite a lot of political or social influence, how would you perhaps like to see the understanding gained from this research on mindfulness manifest itself in everyday life?
Well, I would definitely like to see more and more programs designed to teach mindfulness, especially like just having spaces, say, in public education for mindful timeouts. You know, how kids have recess, and that's definitely a very, very good thing because they're very active and they need to run off some of that energy. They need to be active and all these kinds of things, but they also need to be able to get a little bit more control of their emotions and being able to be better at emotional regulation and have all of these other potential benefits of mindfulness. So I would like to see a lot more training programs in schools and education for people. There already are some examples of schools starting to adopt mindfulness for their children, and they're seeing some pretty good results overall. They're seeing, I think, better attention in class and less disruptive interactions between students. So that's with children, and you can imagine that the benefits would probably just proliferate from there when they get very early mindfulness education. Or from this research that I've generally been talking about, I would like to see the knowledge from this research motivate people to engage in mindfulness in their everyday life so that their interactions with the people around them can be more on a personal basis rather than a group basis. Because when you start dealing with people as a member of a group, you kind of become blind to their individuality, and you start saddling them with all of these expectations that they either can't live up to or they don't need to live up to them. And you're not doing them a very good service, and you're not doing yourself a very good service by limiting your knowledge of this human being to a set of associations that may or may not actually represent them. You're limiting your ability to understand this person on a more depthful level and to interact with them as a human being, as a person. So I think mindfulness is a great ability to put the individual first and the group second, which I absolutely believe is the right order of things, rather than group first and individual second. So I think ultimately I would like to see this research kind of be used as a motivational tool to treat people as individuals rather than just another one of them, I guess you could say, of whatever them might represent.
One question I always ask people, Adam, is that the middle way, as we understand it, is the idea that we make better judgments by avoiding fixed or dogmatic beliefs about things. That then throws us back on experience, so we're left in the sort of messy, uncertain middle. But from our perspective, at least, it's arguably in the messy, uncertain middle that we can actually start to get to grips more adequately with the phenomena that we encounter, whatever they are. Now, how might that relate to what we've been talking about today about mindfulness?
Yeah, so people do like certainty. And when you come to a particular ambiguous situation, and your natural proclivity is to try to impose a certain certainty based on your past experience rather than trying to learn about this novel situation that's happening, there's a very good chance that whatever conclusion that you come to is going to be wrong, and then any consequences of your behavior of that conclusion might be negative. Being in the middle allows you to be okay with that ambiguity, I think. Yeah. Because you're naturally more inclined to attempt to see both the extremes on both sides, or even the lesser extremes on both sides. Yeah. And in that way, you can kind of observe the pros and cons of each side of the argument, and therefore try to come to your conclusions most objectively, and ultimately use perspective taking to the best of your ability to make an appropriate decision. And sure. I think that's a fantastic aspect that I think your organization and I think mindfulness coincide with, is ultimately to reserve judgment, don't get caught up in the need for certainty, allow ambiguous situations, uncomfortable as they may be, to arise, and do your best to wade through the uncertainty and come to the most objective, ultimate conclusion and judgment that you can. And I think that's a fantastic way of just going about your business in everyday life and in politics and in relationships and all of these kinds of things.
Yeah. And also, just because you maintain that degree of uncertainty, that doesn't mean you can't be decisive.
That's right.
And my last question, if people wanted to find out more about your work, how would they go about it?
Well, currently, my research interests and a little bio of me is on the Ball State University website in the psychology faculty section. I'm also on ResearchGate, which is a kind of like a social media forum for researchers. And I'm currently in the process of developing a lab website along with my wife, who does research with me, to kind of showcase our work and to kind of tell people what we're currently working on. So that's not up and running yet. It probably will be a little while before that's up and running, but when it is, it'll probably be linked to the Ball State University website.
Fantastic. Okay, well, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you today, Adam, and a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barry. It's been great.
You can find out more about Middle Way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.